All right, everyone. There was an op-ed by John Paul Stevens in the New York Times, and now it's started a trend on Twitter, I guess. Repeal the Second Amendment, like it's going to actually happen. Let me weigh in with some basic facts. Number one, I have to do that in every gun-related video, so people know, number one, where I stand. Number two, the truth that they're obviously not being told in school. They're obviously not being told by the corporate media. And some other thoughts. First and foremost, I think on a related note, you saw that Fox News poll regarding, the overwhelming majority of Americans support, basically disarmament is what it would boil down to. Raising the age to 21 to buy a gun, mental health, background checks, neither of which are constitutional, by the way. An assault weapons ban, which means nothing because they're already pretty much banned. I think you're thinking of sporting rifles, but, most people don't appear to understand the fact that there's a difference there. The big problem is that I think that it said 90% of Americans want a ban on such weapons. The problem being I'm pretty sure that more than 10% of Americans actually own weapons that would fall under that categorization. Since I don't think I can trust that poll as far as I can throw it, I'm tempted to believe that gun control is far less popular than that's saying. Some people are saying, well, it's a Fox poll, so it's they would never rig it in favor of gun control. Well, you do realize that Fox News is no longer the Fox News it was maybe 10 years ago, right? It's a pure corporate firm. Look, all the pundits and people there at Fox are a bunch of 7- and 8-figure salary Manhattan socialites. They're a bunch of New Yorkers, and so they're urbanites. They don't come from, they're not living out in a farmhouse somewhere. They're rich people that live in penthouses in New York City. And they're owned by rich people who own, private islands. So, yeah, a little bit different maybe there. No, I don't trust Fox. I think you'd have to be ignorant to trust anything that Fox News says or anything that any of these other networks say. Number two, my second thought, is basically come and take it applies here. If you were to attempt to repeal the Second Amendment, say, well, there's no longer a guarantee of gun rights, what would happen? I think a civil war would happen. Yeah, I think that you'd have a second American Revolution more than a civil war, actually. The problem is this, and sometimes people who are like, they get a hard-on thinking about disarming their neighbors because they're sadistic or whatever. They're like, oh, well, your little pea shooter can't stand up to an Abrams tank or a drone. No, that's true. Yeah, you're never going to be able to accomplish that. But 100 million of them probably can, yeah, because there's such a thing as a supply line. Drones require fuel. Tanks require fuel. You need, in order for the military to function, I don't think the military in that sense would even side with the government. I think it'd be joining the civilian population by and large. I think it'd end up with a coup, a soft coup of sorts, with really the politicians being the ones that end up getting marched out and then exiled to exiled into Nantucket and keep them there or something. I just don't think that it would happen. I think you would quickly find that the military would be rather reluctant to deploy most of the massive weapons on its own soil and on its own civilians. I think you'd find that they would be incapable of fielding those weapons for very long because they require a lot of fuel. Our military is supreme because we can well supply it. Like, we have no problem sending massive ships halfway across the world. We would begin to break down pretty quick. By the way, in the resulting turmoil and chaos, whether they sided with the people or not, all of our enemies would come throttling around us, trying to pick away at a military that would be too distracted to defend our nation from them. Now, you could end up with a nuclear war just out of necessity. Wouldn't be pretty. All the vultures would be circling around our corpse at that point, so I don't think you'd like the result. Some other thoughts. Number one, I see a lot of people like on Twitter, they're like, oh, the Second Amendment, we don't need to repeal it because it just guarantees a militia. We need to listen to it. It guarantees we have a military and stuff. Now, the militia is the people. If they wanted to denote a military, which didn't exist when it was written anyway, they would have said the regulars, the right of the people to be protected by regulars shall not be infringed. That would just take the government and force it to maintain a military, which, itself would end up being endlessly reinterpreted. Oh, what size must be maintained? What form must it be maintained in? Does it include a navy? Well, the founders didn't envision planes, so you have no right to an air force. They would have these weird fucking college drunk conversations, which is essentially what a lot of the questioning of the Second Amendment has boiled down to. Regulated, in the sense of the Second Amendment, means well supplied, well stocked, and well able to function, as in a capable civilian population that owns the weapons, owns the ammo, owns whatever it needs to muster and defend the nation against enemies, foreign and domestic. No, it has nothing to do with hunting. The concept that you would rid somebody of their topical firearm that they used to hunt would have been anathema even to the most authoritarian nations back in the 1700s. They said, what are you talking about? Oh, you don't want somebody to be able to have a topical handgun or something? It doesn't make any sense. You know, their little, what's it called? Those little things that they had that had a little tiny mini, like a Derringer or something like that. Like, oh, you wanna rid people of their topical musket. No, I think the British at the time, and the revolution literally became a shooting war because of an attempt at confiscation. An attempt to confiscate a stockpiled group of arms, I believe included multiple cannons, as well as the powder and ball and the muskets and bayonets and swords and stuff. Sort of they have, a civilian armory that they had set up. The British came and said, well, you can't do that. We're getting nervous because you're already disobeying our laws and talking about this representation bullshit and saying you won't pay the tea tax, and you dumped our tea in the water, and that was the last straw. Fuck you, because we all love tea so much. And so they showed up and they said, well, we're taking these weapons and we're destroying this armory. And they got together and said no, and then they ended up sparring with each other. That's really the history of our country. And by the way, gun reform is our founders reformed a system that had been primordially British and instituted the Second Amendment. Gun reform is the Second Amendment. It's a guarantor that people won't be perturbed and harassed for owning the right to defend themselves. It's quite literally the point of the Second Amendment. Gun control is I'm smarter than Dianne Feinstein, and I would never take a rifle with my finger on the trigger and wave it around in front of a crowd of people, not apparently being smart enough to check whether it's even loaded. These are the policymakers. They want to tell us what we can and cannot do to arm ourselves. No, there was another person on Twitter. They're like, oh, we need to protect school children. So yeah, I totally agree with this. And it was funny because it's like, even yesterday, nobody on the left ever said we'd repeal the Second Amendment. They said they just wanted common sense gun reform. Now, of course, they tell us what they've wanted for some time, which is, yes, in their most delusional pipe dreams, what they really want is no Second Amendment. They want no firearms in the country outside of firearms owned by what they call the racist police, the imperialistic military, and a bunch of gang members they swear up and down that they don't want around. I want to smoke my weed, says the middle-aged white liberal. I want to be able to smoke my weed, but all those other drugs are still scary. Prop up the gangs, and we have no problem with Obama giving weapons under Fast and Furious to cartels. Yeah, they can be trusted with machine guns. You can't be trusted with a shotgun that could have been made 200 years ago. I mean, it's crazy talk. But they were talking about protecting children. I thought that was really, really funny because gun control, or I should say disarmament, which is what they're talking about, which wouldn't even work. You'd quickly have a revolution on your hands. That worked so well in Mao's China. Yeah, it worked well on Pol Pot, was a great proponent of taking weapons away from people. Hell, he was so anti-weapon, he conducted his executions with a pickaxe. He's like, I'm not even going to spare a bullet on these stupid peasants. On these former bourgeois individuals, he took urban centers, emptied them of people, and killed them all. Every single last one of them. Or he starved them to death. He's like, okay, go work on this farm. Here's your half bowl of rice. They die. And he's like, oh, I don't care if they die. I want an agrarian society anyway. We don't want industry. We're going to have 100% total proletariat equality, except for me, of course. I have, bunkers, and then the military gets a little more food, but not too much. Maybe I'll spare some of their family members. Others, I'm just going to whack in the head with a pickaxe. Yeah, all those children, hundreds of thousands of children, and millions of people total died. Oh, but it was good. The civilians were disarmed. Look how safe they were. Look at Mao's China. Look at Hitler's Germany. Look at all of these situations. Doesn't it seem somebody was saying, whoa, millions of people have died in the U.S. because of the Second Amendment. Yeah. So you know how many more millions would die if we didn't have one? Guarantee it would be higher. We already would have fallen into a totalitarian situation. There was an attempt, before you think that that's conspiracy mongering, You also said it was conspiracy mongering if anyone said that there were people on the left who wanted to repeal the Second Amendment. And yet you keep making the statement that I see a lot of people agreeing with this basic trending concept. A lot of people that up until yesterday swore up and down it never, they're like, no, I don't want to repeal it. I just don't think you should have an assault weapon. I don't want to repeal it. I just want you to have to be 21 to buy a gun, which is unconstitutional. So now you show your true colors. And there was I retweeted this. So one person saying, oh, this is actually good because the left is showing us what they really believe in. We want this to be a major issue in the midterms. That's not a bad point. Look, you remember after Sandy Hook, what happened? Public discourse, at first it was like, oh, we need to do something about this. Obamacare said, oh, yeah, we'll ban extended magazines and assault weapons and stuff. Very quickly, support for gun control plummeted. Very quickly, Obama got slapped in the cock, shut up about it, never talked about it again. There was a reason for that. The government is not your friend. It's not benevolent, and people eventually, each time this happens, they are swayed by the arguments of those who point out, hey, gun control that is being suggested in the situation that you're mad about wouldn't have even worked. It wouldn't have done anything. None of the proposals being made with regards to so-called gun reform, the ultimate gun reform, again being the Second Amendment itself, none of those proposals would have stopped any of these mass shootings. Wouldn't have stopped Pulse, wouldn't have stopped Parkland, wouldn't have stopped, none of them. It wouldn't stop them. You've got to realize we live in a world by and large that is safe. We also live in one which is truncated occasionally by that 1 in 10 million individuals just a psychopath. And if they can't get a gun, they'll do what Timothy McVeigh did. He killed plenty of people. He didn't need a firearm. Wasn't necessary for him to have a firearm. By the way, you're not even anti-gun. You're just anti-gun in civilian hands. Which would you trust more? The average civilian in your country? Or people that are going to have guns anyway, like gang members? They're still going to be armed. And you say the police are racist. Well, they're going to be armed. You say that our troops are tools of imperialism. They're still going to be armed. Terrorists overseas will still be armed. Warlords in Africa will still be armed. Communist revolutionaries will still be armed. Who does that leave out? Ma and Pa America. Average people who generally, they're not given over to violence. They want to be left alone. But if you try to repeal the Second Amendment, that's a grievous abuse of their rights. And by the way, it's a right, not a privilege. I see people saying, we need to combat soaring gun crime in the U.S. There's no soaring gun crime. The gun crime rate has been stagnant for 3 years after dropping off a cliff since the mid-1990s. Peak crime in the U.S. was in, I believe, 1997. Since then, it plummeted to extremely low levels. It wasn't like this since the 60s or the late 70s. There's no crime spree in the U.S. And we're talking absolute numbers. I can't even imagine per capita in some cases. Property crime is down. Rape is down. Virtually every kind of crime is less prevalent than it was in the 90s that supposedly are like this nostalgic, wonderful time. I don't even understand why people liked them so much. Okay, there's some good rock music. Okay, early video games. Great. That does not a country or culture make, except a really decadent one. It's a problem. No. You're not going to repeal the Second Amendment. Again, come and take it basically adequately describes what would happen. You'd end up with at least tens of millions of people who would refuse. You'd end up having to commit genocide. Oh, so you'd have a lot of gun crime. It's just that I guess the police and the troops and a bunch of liberals with rocks and Molotov cocktails would be killing a bunch of people. Which I don't think would happen. I think even a lot of the police officers at that point would be like, what the fuck are we, I'm not going to shoot all my neighbors. Because I'm not going to shoot Joe over there for refusing to give up his shotgun. It's not going to happen. Fuck yourself. You'd end up seeing mass walk-offs. They'd be replaced probably by left-wing guerrilla fighters, and they would be the ones getting their asses beat. The right wing wouldn't be losing. Be the left wing losing. Probably, you'd end up with a lot of dead Californians at that point. No, it's not going to happen, dude. Thankfully. We've come too far, and there are too many firearms in too many hands at this point. I think for them to be able to do something particularly drastic. They're just going to try to chip slowly away at the Second Amendment so that they can get to some point where they're like, oh, there are only a few million gun owners left. We can kill them all and it won't be too much trouble. We can probably make this work. That appears to be their goal. But there are some of us who, of course, will ideologically stand in their way on that because we realize, gun control is literally a preface to a mass purge. You think that governments are benevolent, you're dumb. That's about all. Peace out.